Yesterday you said that it was about 35 years that you were employed with the provincial government.
38 years.
38 years.
Right.
And you graduated in 1947 with an RN.
Psych nursing and the RN, yeah.
And what took you into psych nursing? I mean, why psych nursing?
I think it was probably because I'm interested in people. I like meeting people, and so it gives you a chance to talk. Because, with the RN, sometimes you don't get to talk to your patients the same way as you would with being a psych nurse.
Was it difficult? Was it a challenge for you to do this, to do your psych nursing?
Not really. Like some things weren't too great, because like in those days they didn't have all the tranquilizing drugs that they have nowadays. And so, you just did the best with what you had.
You must have seen a lot of
changes. I have seen a lot of changes. Changes for the better.
It was a good change.
Oh, yeah.
And can you tell me the story again about how BMHC originally started?
Well, actually, it originally started for a boys' reformatory. And at that time, there was one boy in there. He had stolen a letter from His Majesty's mail. He was supposed to stay in there for a period of 5 years.
And did he?
It's kind of hard to find out just exactly whether he did stay there, because when it became like after 6 months, it cost them something like $30,000 to keep that one boy there, so that certainly wasn't feasible. So the next year it became known as the Insane Asylum, and that name didn't change until 1915 when it became the Brannan Hospital for Mental Diseases.
For no other reason, that is one reason with a name like that maybe it's become such a landmark in Brandon.
Yeah, that's possible too, because people look at and think, oh yeah, terrible things happened up there.
Yeah,
there's a real stigma.
Was that true to your knowledge? I mean,
not really as far as working on the wards and that. I didn't notice that.
So you couldn't validate the stigma that was attached to it. It was simply just that, a stigma. Okay. So the boy stayed for 5 years?
I'm assuming so, because when you read farther along, you'll notice that he was still in the place when it became the Insane Asylum.
With your 38 years, when you look back, have you had good memories?
Oh yes, I have some really good memories.
You've enjoyed it?
Oh, I enjoyed it, yeah. I wouldn't like to do it nowadays because I think it's altogether different. It was a challenge in those days.
When was the BMHC building built?
It was built in 1890, and it wasn't built for a mental hospital. It was built for a boys' reformatory.
And why was it changed from a boys' reformatory?
And at that time, they had one person in there, William Mulligan, and after 6 months, it cost them something like $30,000 to keep that boy in there. So the next year, it became known as the Insane Asylum.
There was a fire.
In 1910, there was a fire.
And how did administration cope with that? What happened? Do they know how it started?
They don't really know, because they were doing some renovating on the east side of the building, and they figured that maybe it was due to faulty wiring.
And the residents were moved?
Yes, they were moved down to the Winter Fair building, which is now where Safeways is on 10th and Victoria Avenue.
When was the BMHC name changed then?
Okay, it wasn't changed until 1915, and then it became known as the Brannan Hospital for Mental Diseases.
What was the name of the insane asylum? Was that its original name?
That was its original name, yeah, and that didn't change like till 1915.
It's always been a teaching hospital.
Since 1923, it's been a teaching hospital.
And are all the graduation pictures displayed?
I don't think we have everybody's picture, but we're trying to get them.
Do you know how many staff were employed at BMHC throughout the years and how many residents there were at its peak?
At its peak in the 1950s, we had 1,800 patients.
That would have been quite a few to each room.
Yes, it would have. Well, some wards had 150 patients on them.
How about staff? Do you know how many staff were involved?
I would say that there's around 700 staff working up here.
Do you remember the farm when they had farming up here?
Yes, they had farm, they had Holstein cows, and it was kind of interesting because when Dr. Johnson was touring through the museum, he said that every year he had to get up in the legislature and say that we're still the premier breeders of Holstein cows.
How long did that go for, do you know?
Well, I think that was for quite a while, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And all the residents participated, the ones that were willing and able?
Yeah, that's right.
Was it a good idea, a good activity?
Well, I think it was a good idea because it kept people occupied, and especially if somebody came from a farm originally, they would really like to work on the farm.
And because BMHC had a large catchment area, no doubt many people were from a farm.
Yeah,
and
right.
especially the era as well, the time.
Mm-hmm.
Why did it discontinue?
Well, when the NDP government came in 1974, then they decided that they didn't need the farm anymore.
No doubt it had to be pretty difficult getting individuals to get up at minus 30 or minus 40 weather.
Degrees, yeah.
Did they also have a greenhouse and a garden?
Yes, they had a greenhouse, and they had an orchard where, they grew fruit.
And for the same purpose, it was a good activity?
Yes, it was good for the residents.
And no doubt it was discontinued for the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit about mental health industries?
Mental health industries used to be down where McFadden's store is on 9th Street there. And what would happen is the things that were made up here, like the woodworking and all of the women's tatting and embroidery and that, were taken down to that store and they were sold there. And then the proceeds would come back up here.
Another good activity.
Oh, yes.
And also discontinued.
Yeah, it was discontinued.
You told me earlier that they had a beauty parlor.
Yes, it was the first one in a mental hospital in Canada.
Had to be a good idea, combination of
Yeah, right.
people taking care of their hygiene
and looking after themselves.
and learning a skill. Mm-hmm. Do you know something about the Selkirk treatment? Can you tell me a little bit about that and what it is?
The only thing that they have different to what we had here is that they have a forensic ward.
So if an individual had committed a crime,
Yeah, they would go into the forensic ward.
is it still being done?
As far as I know, it's still being used.
Can you tell me something about the airing court?
The airing court was where they would take the men out to get their exercise, and it looked very much like the jail down here because they had somebody posted in each corner so that the men were more inclined to run away than the women were, because when it got dark, the women didn't like to be out.
This was more a daily routine.
Yeah, right. It was a daily routine.
They'd go out for a couple of hours for fresh air.
right on.
Were there activities? Could they exercise? It was walking, just?
Just walking around, yeah.
Now, can you tell me something about insulin shock therapy? First of all, why was it used and what was the procedure? You as a nurse.
I think it was mostly if somebody was run down or that, it would sort of build them up because they would give 100 milligrams of insulin first thing in the morning, and then later on they would have to tube feed them.
Did you participate in cold bath treatment?
Yep.
How did that work?
Well, that was when they would soak a sheet in cold water and wrap the patient up like a mummy, and then they had a canvas thing that went over top of their bed, and that was fastened to their bed.
What was the thinking behind that?
Well, if somebody was running up and down on the ward, you know, they would be all hot and bothered anyway, so what it would do is make them relax. They'd go off to sleep.
Was it meant to be more of a physical shock to their body? No?
Not really. I think it was just given to relax them, because you have to remember in those days they didn't have all the drugs that they have nowadays.
Could you tell me something about straitjackets and the use of them? Now, they're no longer being used right now.
No, they haven't been used since the 50s.
But the idea behind the straitjacket was to have someone put it on and...
Well, yeah, and then if somebody was abusive to themselves, like some patients would be inclined to bite themselves or that, and so when you put them in the straitjacket, then it protected them and also protected the other patients, because, you know, they might be inclined to go and grab somebody by the throat.
From your experience, was that a successful treatment? I assume no, because it's no longer being done, but did it have a purpose, or was it...
Well, I think it had a purpose at the time, because, I mean, you have to remember that you didn't have the tranquilizing drugs, so that makes a difference nowadays.
And the safety of the individual would have been a primary concern.
Right,
and
yeah.
the safety of others.
That's
other
right.
residents.
Other residents in the building, yeah.
And other staff as well.
And staff, too. Yeah, because you wouldn't like to be grabbed by the throat or pulled by your hair, and I've had my hair pulled quite a few times. I've been pulled all the way down the back stairs.
Was that a concern as an employee working here, that you could be in a little bit of danger?
Well, you could be, but you didn't really think about it too much, because you had other things going on. I mean, you went to classes and that, so it was quite different.
It was on the back burner, in the back of your head, but not in the forefront.
Yeah, not in the forefront.
Have you had good experiences as an employee, as a nurse here? Did you have good experiences?
Oh, yes, I would say I've had very good experiences.
Did you ever feel that you were threatened? Did it ever come close?
No, other than being pulled by my hair down the back stairs, and then the girl the next day didn't even remember doing it, so.
You're such a pleasant person that I imagine it took a lovely, pleasant personality to survive as an employee.
Right, yeah.
You had to be able to talk to individuals.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Were you familiar with lobotomies? They were done here.
Yes, they did those until about 1956.
Why did they do those?
Well, I think they were trying to change their behavior pattern, because like they'd take a piece of bone out of each side of their temple here, and but the only thing is a lot of those people that had the lobotomies done had very bad seizures, you know, GM seizures that were really bad. They would turn blue.
Was that after, you mean?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
After. Mm-hmm. So it definitely had a side effect.
Mm-hmm.
The restraining chairs, did you have restraining chairs where individuals would sit and, so to speak, be shackled?
Well, you might have somebody in a straitjacket and you could have their ankles fastened to the leg of the chair.
Was there a specific restraining chair that was used, or it was?
No, they have those wooden ones like you saw in the other room there.
How about the cage bed?
Well, I don't know, but I never saw it used, but I would think that it would be enough to give you a heart attack. If somebody was very disturbed and you put that cage over top of them, that would be enough to give you a heart attack.
That was ideally for sleep time in the evening?
Not necessarily, it could be in any time of the day, really.
Especially with the blanket over top. So individuals were using the technology of the day, and they were using it with good intentions.
That's right. They did the best with what they had to work with.
And that was good.
Yeah.
Was it a good place to work?
Oh, I thought it was. I don't have any bad memories about the place.
BMHC was involved with a lot of, I'll call it community relations, but a lot of sports and recreation activities. Curling, hockey.
Well, like we had curling and we had a miniature golf course and we had a tennis court and lots of curling and ice skating. So there's lots of activities. There's always something to do.
And they had entertainers up here. They had
Yes.
entertainment, they had evening dances and so forth.
They had dances and they had a movie once a week on Fridays.
They had a movie house then, or was that?
Oh, yeah. They had a movie house up here.
How did the museum start, and when did it start?
Well, the museum started in 1972, and we set up a group to look after it. And so at that time, Doug Smith was the president, and I was the secretary, and then we had a board of directors, which was Gary Matten, because he was very interested in the museum.
You became the curator by default.
Right. I'm just keep on doing it.
People were asked to submit things of some memorabilia that they may have had. They gave
That's
it,
right,
they
yeah.
put it in your office, gave it to you,
Yeah,
and you found a place for it.
right.
You also have a book out, or you have a
Yes,
book
we have a
available.
history book.
And you have a guest sheet, and you're willing to take tours.
Right on.
Did you ever receive something you didn't expect
While I was here,
as far as the museum?
yeah, I've got an award from Lloyd Henderson and Marge McKinnon. They signed it, and I got this award.
Electric shock therapy, not being used as much today.
Well, the only difference is now they have an anesthetist come, and like when we first did it, you always had to hold the patient down, like from top to bottom. And that way they wouldn't jerk themselves so much. And
Was that an effective treatment?
well, I guess it was at the time, because that's all, like there's a lot of people that come back and ask for shock therapy.
It was quite traumatic. You as a nurse, it would be quite traumatic
Well,
to
it was
administer.
very traumatic, because I mean, and this idea of holding them down, like I like the idea they have now, because they bring an anesthetist and he gives them a muscle relaxant, and so it's much easier on them.
The Brandon Mental Health Center was very much a standalone facility, a standalone entity in the community. It had its own fire
Well,
department.
definitely, yeah,
It had its own dentist's office.
right,
There was an operating theater,
yes, till 1964,
laundry services,
laundry services, yes.
and no doubt, well, obviously a maintenance department for renovations
definitely.
and remodeling. Now, what we have here is one of your old uniforms, I understand.
Right.
You wore that how many years ago?
Oh, I wore it till for about 93, I guess.
It seems like a lifetime.
Yeah, right.
And that actually is your uniform.
That's my uniform, yeah.
And
it is.
And it still fits her.
Oh, well, yes, I'm sure it would still fit. Because I put my graduation uniform on the other day there, and I still could get into it.
Oh, gee, that is amazing. That says something. That's good.
Well, I try to keep in shape.
That's all right. Now, I understand that you worked this switchboard at one time.
Well, every time, when you worked evenings, you had to relieve on the switchboard, so, it was really neat because you got to know what was going on around the place.
You eavesdropped.
Yes, right.
And you weren't supposed to. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's still here.
Yes, and I had to laugh. Garth Rice was up here one time, and he said, oh yeah, he said they had to get his mother one because she used to work the switchboard. Now, years ago, when people were mentally ill, they were kept at Lower Fort Garry, and if you've ever been to Winnipeg, you'll find that building is still there. Now, our first building was not built for a mental hospital, it was built for a boys' reformatory, and at that time there was one person in here, and he had stolen a letter from His Majesty's Mail, and he was committed to stay here for 5 years. Of course, so after 6 months, it cost him something like $30,000 to keep that one boy there, so that wasn't feasible. And so the next year, it became, in 1891, it became known as the Insane Asylum. And that name didn't change until 1915, when it became known as the Brandon Hospital for Mental Diseases.
And these are some of the pictures of way back when.
Yeah, right. Of course, in 1910, they had a big fire, and there was one wall left standing. And we have the Daily Journal from the Brandon Fire Department, and we have the front page of the Brandon Sun, and it doesn't call them patients, clients, or residents. It says the lunatics were running around.
That was after the fire.
And then after the fire, they walked the patients down to the Winter Fair building, which used to be where Safeways is on 10th and Victoria Avenue.
And they still refer to them as the lunatics.
Well, in the Brandon Sun, they said that the lunatics were running around. And like here, the heading here says, the Fair building is now the Insane Asylum. Thank goodness terminology has changed through the years.
You wouldn't get by with that today, would you?
No, you wouldn't, definitely wouldn't. Mm-mm. This is a picture of Dr. Schultz. He was also the mayor of Brandon at one time.
And what is he doing there?
Well, he's shaking hands with Helen Kalakela.
A lot of the pictures on the wall are about graduations.
Yes, right. We start with the graduation and then we go down, yeah.
Because this was a teaching hospital.
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm.
And pretty well always was?
Since 1923. Mm-hmm. That was the first graduating class, was in 23. I don't know whether you've ever been in the nurses' residence, but it's a beautiful building.
And it's still today?
Oh yeah, it's still there, yeah. It was built in 1923. It's been designated as a historical building, and this building that we're in now is called Parkland Building, and then the one up on the hill there is Pine Ridge. So these are some more 1932 graduation, 1927, 1929.
How did you come to collect or get these? I assume they were archived. Were they intentionally archived even back from 1923, or at one time somebody came up with an idea of starting a museum and let's collect and see what's left?
What we did is we sent out a notice out to the wards, and we said if anybody has anything that they think would be interesting for a museum, mm-hmm. would you just drop it off in, usually it was in my office that it came to.
Let's just talk about that a little bit. You're the curator of the museum. You've been associated with the museum since its inception.
Yeah, since it started.
And you said, I think at one time, 1972, is that right?
Right on.
How did you become...
Well, I'm a history buff. I really like history, and so I was interested in the history of the hospital.
I could relate to that because when I first came in, there is a bit of a warmth with the memories in the past of you could sense it in the room. It must have taken years then to gather all of this stuff and put it
Well,
together.
yes, and we're still getting things too, because the other day there I got somebody came to my door and they had a violin that had been made from a Salata box.
Really?
I couldn't believe it. Yeah, it was the Duguid family, and Charlie Duguid used to work up here at one time, so it was interesting to get it. And this goes 1915, and this is kind of interesting because Jim McRae, who he writes for the Sun off and on. His mother, or his wife's mother-in-law worked up here, and she was called Miss Pugh. Yeah, so that was interesting too.
You've spent all of your life in Brandon?
Yes, I have. Well, I actually was born in Toronto, Ontario, but but I've been all my life in Brandon. Yep. Yep. Went to school in Brandon here.
Now, some of these pictures...
and these are some of the buildings when they were going up. See, like there's Pine Ridge, which is this one here, and this is the dining room over there in Pine Ridge, which used to be.
They're impressive buildings.
Yes, they are. From like the structure is really eye-catching, isn't it? Eh?
Oh, it is.
Yeah, it is very. And they built them to last too, because like when they were trying to put an elevator into the nurses' residence there, they had a terrible time because they couldn't get through that thick cement that they had over there.
Really? Yeah. The pictures are just great. Have you included every picture, everything you have, or are these more some of the select pictures?
No, I think we've just been putting them up as we get them.
A lot of memories.
Oh, terrific. And this is a single room over there in Bellevue. It looks quite cozy looking,
What was it used? Was it?
It was called a psychiatric institute at one time, and what would happen is you would start out on the first floor and then gradually work your way up, and then if you didn't improve, then you would get transferred over here to the main building.
As you got rehabilitated, or you worked yourself up?
Yeah, right. As you improved, then you would work up to second, third floor. And there's 3 floors in that building.
That is something.
And that's Valley View right there. And some of these pictures are really interesting because it looks, when you get over here, this looks the same as Rideau Park because what they did is it looks as though they took the architectural plans out and thought, oh, well, let's make another building like that so it has an east and west side and then the courtyard in the middle.
When did the patients leave?
1998 was the last time we had anybody up here. And we had our own operating theater here until 1964. And what they would do if somebody needed their appendix out, they would bring an anesthetist and a surgeon up from Brandon, and then he would, the nurses up here would do the circulating, and okay, and this is kind of a, really upsets me because apparently at one time, if somebody was disturbed, they would put this cage bed over them.
And where did you get these nurse models?
Oh, well, we got the mannequins from downtown, from one of the stores downtown, and then we got the uniforms from the girls. Well, in fact, the instructor was up here the other day, and she said that that was her uniform.
You're kidding.
And that's my uniform over there in the corner.
Really?
Yes, that's my own uniform.
Wow. Well, that is a keepsake, isn't it?
Yeah. This is an old switchboard, and it's really neat because you always, when you relieved the telephone operator, if you were the evening supervisor, then you had to relieve the telephone operator. So it was fun because you could listen in on the conversations.
What is the name of this room? Does it have a name?
No, it doesn't have a name.
Okay, but
No, it's, we just started sort of put things in here as we think they should be. But this is an old organ, and it came from Norwood Gardens, and it... And it's it's really neat, but you have to keep pumping, you know, and it's like the old Singer sewing machines. This here was furniture that was used out on the grounds, and you can see that it's being made because it's got the wood here and then it's got the wicker in here. So all we have to do is oil it up every once in a while so that it doesn't get dried out. This is your straitjacket. And these things have not been used since the 50s. And I always have somebody, when the classes come up here, I always have somebody to model it for me.
Yes. Yeah. What is that piece of wood that's... What's that piece of wood right there, right ahead
Here?
of you? Yeah.
You know what that is? You never believe it, but that is a...
Well, I know what it looks like from here.
It's not a guillotine, because it's what so many of them say. It's for slicing bread. And this, you can imagine slicing a few hundred loaves of bread because some wards had 150 patients on them.
Oh.
Yeah.
A couple of canes over in the corner? Is that canes up top? Or not swords? Or they must be canes. They can't be swords up top.
No. Oh, here?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are canes. When Dr. Schultz was here, he put on a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan plays, and these are some of the props.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you got shoes with the pointed toes and the round toes, and then they used to carry their top hats in these cases.
Oh, okay.
And this is kind of interesting because this is a medicine tray, and you can see it's been made. And so you would put your card behind here and then your medicine glass in front. And we have a couple of those.
I noticed you have poetry on the wall, or
Yeah, the registered nurses, psych nurses pledge, and the lament of a psych nurse. And this wheelchair here also makes out into a stretcher, and we loaned it at one time to Neelan High School because they were putting on the play Annie, and so the president needed a wheelchair to sit in, so so we loaned them the chair.
What have we got up top of the shelf?
Well, those, I have to be very careful because somebody was here and corrected me the other day, and I said they were Eskimo carvings. They look like Eskimo carvings, but they're wood. And she said, oh no, Inuit. I said, okay.
When the residents were here, they came only from Manitoba or across
Oh,
Canada?
no, they came right across to Saskatchewan border and up north until to the Paw. 49th parallel, I guess you'd call it. This is the mouse trap here, and believe it or not, it really works because I left it out one day and there was a dead mouse in it, so I know it works.
How does it work?
Well, you run in there and then you get caught in the maze.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
And then here we also have glasses and old cutlery. Okay, here we have the old enamelware before we got the stainless steel. And then this is an example of how they used to have to boil up make their hypos. And here, this is a straw hat, and it was woven by a patient, and he took the straw from the field and made it into a straw hat. And here we have some weapons in this, and that was for the patients to either protect themselves from us or from the other patients.
say that again. Why would they need weapons?
Well, because they felt they had to protect themselves. You know, if they were real paranoid, they'd protect themselves from the other patients or from us. You know, because
They made them, you mean?
well, some patients would really think that you're out to get them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then those are keys, and what they might do is take a key from a sardine can and add a little bit more to it, because at one time all the buildings had different locks. Nowadays I think they're pretty well all on the same lock. And there is a dish, and it says the insane asylum, so you would have a constant reminder where you were. And that whistle there, what would happen, we had the men on one side and the women on the other side, so if the girls needed help, they would blow that whistle, and then somebody would come over from the men's side to help them. And then we have some gloves in there that were knitted, and there's a Bible that was carved by somebody. Yeah. And in the back we have a tablecloth there, and that was done by a schizophrenic patient, and you can see she had flight of ideas because she jumps from a flower to a house or whatever, or a face.
Yeah.
No, this is not mine. This is somebody's uniform, and this cape originally belonged to Marion Patterson because she was over in England, and she worked with those people that had to have a lot of surgery because of burns and that. And these chairs here came from the nurses' residence, and you can see that they've been well taken care of. And
Pictures on the wall again of graduating classes?
well, this is a 1964 class, you know, and some of those people are still around in Brandon here.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And of course, there's the uniform there. That's when you wore the bibs and the aprons and the whole bit. Those desks used to be in our rooms, and that's what we did our homework on.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. In the late 40s and 50s, they used to do what they called insulin therapy. And of course, the patient would get 100 units in the morning, and then they would have to be tube fed because they would go into a coma. And sometimes we had to use these restraints because they were inclined to throw themselves out on the floor.
What was the reason for the insulin therapy?
Well, it was a builder-upper, like, you know, some of these patients were really run down, you know, when they first came in here. And so insulin therapy built them up.
Was it related, though, to diabetes?
Not really, no.
Didn't.
No. There wasn't anybody that had diabetes.
Okay.
This is what you call a tent, and it would go over the patient, and then the oxygen would go into the tent. Much simpler nowadays with a catheter or a mask. Yeah. Okay, now here you'll notice that we have a doll, and that came from the demonstration room over in the nurse's residence. And this is how they taught, you know, to diaper the baby and take its temperature and all those good things. And this is what you call a breck feeder, because if you had a patient with a hair lip, then they can't suck. So you would put this in their mouth and then squeeze this end here, and the formula would go into their mouth. And then, of course, we've got the scales for weighing the baby. And then we've got all the formula bottles and the formula here. The fracture cart. And see, this is the sandbags, which if you would use them to immobilize, if somebody had a broken leg or that, you would use them to immobilize the leg. And this is from the operating theater, and this is what the doctors would use to wash their hands in there. This is an instrument sterilizer. And this is a drum. It was used in the operating room because they would put their drapes and towels in there, and then they would put it into the autoclave to be sterilized. And these were used if somebody had something wrong with their leg or that, in order to keep the covers off of the leg, then they would use these.
What is that?
This thing here?
Yeah.
You never believe you know what it is?
No.
It's a hairdryer. Very antiquated looking one. Like we're more used to this type here. And this is kind of interesting because this is what we call a shock machine. And so what would happen is they would put a pad on each lobe here, and then they would put this on here, and then they flick the switch on from 0.3 to 0.5 seconds, and then anywhere up to 170 volts of electricity. And in the early days, we always had to hold the patient down. You know, like nowadays it's much different, because I had one of the students up here the other day, and she was telling me that like the anesthetist comes now and gives them a muscle relaxant, and it's much better than it was in those days. But in those days, they just got something like sodium amytal about an hour before they're going to have treatment, and then they got the treatment. But the part that I didn't really like is when you had to hold them down, because if they didn't, they could injure their back or that, you know. So you always had to do the hips and the ankles and the shoulders with some pressure. When I was in Winnipeg, they had a lot of polio at that time, and so what they would do is take these pads, like this would be filled out with water and then plugged in because it's electrical, and then they would put these pads on their joints because that relieved the pain in the joints. Here we have more enamel wear. This is a fracture cart, and this is where you have the plaster and that to, if somebody needed to have a cast on, then they would use all of this stuff here. And this is kind of interesting because this is when they cut the cast off. I used to think that, like I had a broken wrist at one time, and I thought, oh, they're gonna He's gonna cut my arm. But it doesn't happen that way. And these are the capes that the nurses used to wear. And these are brown ones, but the one that I had was a navy one with the red lining inside it. This is another wheelchair, and it's really an old one. Now this picture here used to hang in the superintendent of nurses' office, and when you got called up, if you were in trouble or that, you'd look and say, oh yes, I'm going to be a bedside nurse, or I'm going to be a surgical nurse, or maybe I'm going to get fired. And this is kind of interesting because this is Dr. Schultz's graduation class, and they're always saying that there's hardly any female doctors. But if you look in this picture, there's quite a few. And this is a 1925 picture. Mm. And this is a heat machine, so if you had an infection on your arm, you could turn it on for 5 minutes and it would draw out the infection. You can notice that the dolls here have either red or blue insignia on them, because from the lab girls would have the red on their sleeve and the nurses would have the blue. BMH, Manitoba, Brand Mental Hospital. That's what it stood for. Yeah, and then we have some of the diplomas from the different classes that have graduated up here. And on the table here we have the yearbook from the School of Nursing. It was kind of interesting because the girl that was with the students here the other day there, she showed this picture because it was her. But this is kind of neat. This is a graduation dance program. And this is the weekly schedule of your work for the week. And this here is the diploma that for psych nursing.
That's a lovely picture.
It is a good picture, isn't it? Very good, yeah. Yeah, it really shows off the front of the main building with all the little cupolas and that up on top. Well, that's the type of clothing that the women would have at one time. You know, because you used to put in your, in the fall and the spring, you would put in a requisition to the stores to get the clothing. And so those are some of the clothing that they wore. Yeah, and this is a picture. These pictures in here. This is the photograph album of our sports day, because they used to have a sports day every summer up here. Annual sports day, and this was in 1976. And we have some more volumes of pictures. Well, these here are like the annual report. And they're kind of interesting. And then we have an employee's handbook. That tells you what you can do and you can't do. Yeah, and then these are some of instant shock therapy. That tells you all about it. And then, of course, there's general regulations. Oh, this is a skeleton, and it comes from the classroom over in the nurses' residence. And that's how people learned their anatomy.
And the same thing here in the...
Yeah, that's the heart and lungs. And and then when we come over here, this is what you call a dictaphone. And what the doctor would do was, on this cylinder here, he would dictate his notes. And then the steno would take it out to her office and listen in, and then she'd type up what was on the cylinder. And that's an adding machine there, and of course this is the hospital stamp, when you had to stamp everything that was legal. And then these are the pens you used when you did nice printing with the red and the blue ink. And this is an inkwell.
And the old phone.
Yeah, that's the old type of phone that they used to have, yeah. This is the EEG machine, and it does the brain tracings. Say somebody was an epileptic, they would know which part of the brain was affected. And if say you had a tumor in some area of the brain, this could show it on here too. And this is the original one that they had too, like the one that they have nowadays at the Assiniboine is computerized and it's really very up to date.
Mm-hmm.
This is the dentist office. I was saying this is kind of interesting because you could have teeth to match your outfit. This is the X-ray machine here, so that would get your teeth X-rayed. They'd be using that. And this is kind of interesting because you hear people talking about their gallstones and you can see why they hurt because look, they just look like stones off the road. 1974 was when the lab moved down to the Westman lab at the General Hospital. So we took pictures of everybody that was still working up here.
And some pictures on the wall of various anatomy parts, I think?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. That's true. And this is a BMR machine, and thank goodness nowadays all you have to do is have some blood taken out of your arm, and they can tell what your thyroid's doing. But in these days you had to have, well, they would pinch your nose off here and then turn this machine on. Mm-hmm. Then we have some parts over here, and because they had their own pathology lab up here. It's really amazing because they had a 25th anniversary, and some of these things they came up here and said, oh yeah, we still use those things. They used to have their own football team, and they won a lot of championships.
Some of the memorabilia on the wall, of course, pictures again.
Yeah, those are pictures of football team, and there's a baseball team over here. This is the cobbler's bench here, and you can see all the different sizes of shoes. And years ago they had what they called plug tobacco, and they would have to chop it up.
This is kind of like an activity room for staff and residents.
We had a fellow that used to make his own games, and this is his checkers and his snakes and ladders. And then in the box there he has dominoes. That was our Stanley Walzak, and his parents took him out to Expo in '86, and when he came back he painted some of these pictures of the mountains. And this is something that he made, was a church, and you can see how much work he put into it because it's got a place for the minister and for the choir and then for all the parishioners.
Oh yeah.
He also was very good at making instruments and that, so this is one of his, and well, I'm not really just sure, it looks like a harpsichord or something like that. And he made other like violins and guitars and that too. And they used to show the cattle at the winter and the summer fair, and so over there on that wall are some of the ribbons that they won. Desk originally came from Ireland. It was donated to us, but it was in the greenhouse for ages and ages.
Lovely desk.
Yeah, it really is something. It's very an antique, really. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we have the milk cans and the bottles when we were environmentally friendly we used the glass ones. And then over here, this is the way they mostly had those terrazzo floors, and so they would put a block of wax in there and then push it up and down on the floor to wax it. And then they would take a 25-pound block and put a piece of blanket cloth under it and polish the floor. And then, of course, we've got scrub boards. Those are scrub boards. And then, of course, years ago, people always thought they had to have boil their clothes, so we have a boiler there. And a lot of people that come around are always telling me, oh yeah, I can remember when that used to sit on the wood stove, you know, boil up the clothes. Yeah, those are from the laundry. And like the laundry up here before it moved down to the general hospital did a lot of work. Like at one time they did Sioux Valley out there, they did the place there, and they did a lot of different places around town. Fire hoses, and like you have to remember, at one time the fire department did not come up here. They had their own bucket brigade, and that would be what they would have to use if there was a fire up here.
Rattle, rattle, little key, how I hate the sight of thee. Only thou canst ope the lock of the door at which I knock. From early morn till late at night, oh, how wretched is my plight. Each locked door at which I stand will only ope at thy command. When carried by a nurse's hand, thou art like a fairy's wand. Strongest locks give way to thee, oh, how powerful, little key. When filled with anger or with woe, I to a quiet spot would go, there to sit alone and sigh, or mop the teardrop from my eye. I find, as oft I found before, that thou hast once more locked my door. Dost thou wonder, little key, that I hate the sight of thee? The world is ruled, so someone said, by the hand that rocks the crib, but the hand that holds the key rules the globe, it seems to me.